Tonight we time travel back to the sunburnt plains and parched shores of early colonial Australia, where the air smells faintly of sweat, salt, and something burnt in a clay oven. You've just stepped off a creaky wooden ship, ankles swollen from the voyage, stomach groaning, and in your hand, a few coins from the old world that no one here cares about. Because in this strange new colony, what you eat might just be worth more than what you're paid. There's a breeze rustling through the sparse gum trees, the faint call of a kookaburra somewhere up the hill, and you glance around wondering how on earth you'll survive this, because spoiler, you probably won't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the narrow pathways of Sydney Cove in 1790, little more than a scatter of tents, bark huts, and some very confused sheep. The first settlers, mostly convicts, soldiers, and a few volunteers who must have lost a bet, are trying to make this place work. But here's the catch: money means nothing. Back in England, shillings and guineas were the rhythm of daily life. But here in the new colony, there are no banks, barely any shops, and a grand total of zero economic structure. Imagine trying to buy a loaf of bread with a gold coin, and the baker shrugs like, "Mate, I can't eat that." So, the barter system rises fast. People trade whatever they've got: buttons, boots, a shot of rum, or a favor from someone who knows someone. You quickly learn that survival isn't about how much you own, but how useful you are. And nothing is more useful than food. Bread, in particular, becomes central. Not just any bread, though wheat bread. Imported flour is rare and wildly expensive, and local wheat farming hasn't yet caught up. So if you can bake a half-decent loaf, congratulations, you're now rich. At this point, the colony's tiny population is starving more often than not. Ships are delayed, crops fail, and rations are tightly controlled. You might get 6 ounces of flour a day, maybe less if the weather's bad. And by flour, we sometimes mean weevily, worm-riddled, questionably edible powder. You scrape by, making damper, a kind of rough soda bread, or experimenting with crushed maize or cassava. Whatever you can mix, mash, and maybe burn into a crust. And somewhere in the middle of this culinary desperation, bread starts to take on a new meaning. Not just food. Not just comfort. It becomes currency. You see your neighbor trade a half loaf for a few nails and a day's help fixing his roof. Someone else pays for laundry with 2 rolls and a biscuit. The local surgeon accepts bread in exchange for pulling a tooth, though he grumbles about wanting rum instead. The irony isn't lost on you. Imagine telling someone back in England that you paid your rent with focaccia. Historians still argue whether the bread as currency idea arose naturally from pure necessity, or whether it was a subtle protest against the British administration's strict rationing. After all, if the government controls your coins, but not your crusts, you might as well bake your own economy. One of the earliest documented transactions involved a military officer trading baked goods for the services of a local carpenter, effectively using a hot loaf as a day's wage. There were no ledgers, no receipts, just trust and carbs. But this new economy isn't just about calories, it's also about prestige. Your ability to bake well, or access good flour, starts to reflect your status. A burnt, lopsided damper might buy you a bundle of kindling. A perfectly risen sourdough? That's rent for a week. And the best part? Bread is inherently shareable. Unlike coins, it invites community. People start gathering around fire pits, swapping stories and slices, quietly shaping a social fabric out of dough. There's one convict named Paddy, no one's quite sure if that's his real name or just convenient colonial shorthand, who becomes semi-famous for trading elaborate braided loaves. He carves initials into the crusts, makes tiny decorative wheat sheaves on top. His bread is considered high value, and people line up for it, offering everything from fishhooks to hand-sewn socks. Bread isn't just money, it's art. And it's everywhere. Even kids get in on it. A boy of about 10 is spotted near the docks, trading pocket-sized buns to sailors in exchange for sweets and shiny buttons. One sailor jokes that the kid's going to become governor one day if he keeps baking like that. But with this growing bread economy comes a creeping anxiety. You start to worry, what happens when the wheat runs out? What if someone starts hoarding flour? Can bread be counterfeited? The answer to that last one is yes. You hear whispers of people adding chalk or crushed tree bark to stretch their dough. One guy gets caught selling hollow loaves, the inside carved out and filled with sawdust. He's shunned and ends up sleeping in the tool shed behind the governor's hut. There's no jail for bread fraud, just extreme side-eye. But for now, your pouch of coins gathers dust on the shelf, while your clay oven is hot day and night. You've stopped worrying about wages. Your wealth smells of yeast and singed crust. And your fingers are perpetually dusted in flour. Because in this strange new land, you don't get rich with gold. You rise with bread. You wipe sweat from your brow as the morning sun slices through the thick eucalyptus haze. Your boots crunch over the dry earth as you head down the path to the storehouse, passing a man carrying a wooden barrel sloshing with something dark, sticky, and unmistakably alcoholic. He nods at you with a grin missing more teeth than it should. Because before bread earned its crown, this colony ran on rum and things got very weird. When the British first settled New South Wales, they quickly discovered a money problem. They didn't have any. The few coins they brought barely stretched, and shipments from England were wildly irregular. So, the colony improvised, rum became the de facto currency. Not just a drink. Not a treat. A whole system of trade. You want your roof fixed? Pay in rum. Need a new pair of trousers? Half a pint, please. Convict labor, house repairs, livestock, and even marriages greased with grog. And yes, the local military was absolutely in on it. The New South Wales Corps, cheekily nicknamed the Rum Corps, controlled the importation and distribution of rum. Imagine the police, army, and liquor store all rolled into one. It's like giving the IRS free tequila and telling them to govern fairly. What could possibly go wrong? You hear tales of soldiers hoarding barrels in underground stores, doling out small servings in exchange for outrageous favors. One captain allegedly sold a plot of land for a few jugs and a jar of pickled onions. No one knows if he was drunk at the time, but the onion part feels oddly specific. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate setup by the officers or just a desperate improvisation. Either way, the colony started to spiral. Drunkenness became epidemic. Work productivity sank. Fights broke out over short pause. You once saw two grown men slap each other silly over a watered-down tot. And it wasn't just about drinking. Rum was stored wealth. People literally buried it for safekeeping. One settler allegedly lost his entire life savings when a possum chewed through the corks of his hidden stash. Meanwhile, the colony's commandants watched helplessly or, depending who you ask, gleefully as the economy sloshed in barrels and the community stumbled home from the tavern. Governor Bligh, yes, the same guy from the Bounty Mutiny, tried to clean things up. He banned the rum trade, declared new rules, issued loud proclamations. The response? The infamous Rum Rebellion of 1808. That's right, you lived through the only successful military coup in Australian history, and it's all because the governor dared to mess with people's liquor. The New South Wales court arrests Bligh in his own house. Supposedly, he hides under a bed. The irony is rich. In the aftermath, everyone sobers up at least long enough to realize that maybe, just maybe, a society shouldn't be built on booze. Trade grows sluggish. Tempers run high. And you start hearing whispers in the marketplace of a more stable alternative. Bread. At first, it seems laughable. Bread. As money. But think about it, it doesn't get you drunk, it can't be hoarded for years, and nobody's getting arrested for a loaf, yet. Besides, with wheat becoming more common thanks to Governor Macquarie's agricultural push, bread is everywhere. And unlike rum, which you swill away in seconds, a loaf of bread can be stretched, shared, bartered in chunks. It's visible, tangible, safe. You hand over a piece, and there's no confusion, it's worth what it's worth. But during the awkward handover from rum to bread, chaos reigns. You hear stories of deals gone wrong. One man offers to repair a cart in exchange for 2 days of bread, but his client brings him a flat, sad damper the size of a showbox. They argue about portion sizes for an hour. Someone nearby starts drawing up loaf measuring guidelines with a stick in the dirt. There's no central bank. No rules. Just crust and trust. Of course, not everyone jumps ship immediately. A group of hard-nosed settlers in Parramatta insists on sticking to rum. You pass one of them one evening, his beard matted with flour and regret, mumbling that bread can't warm your bones like a good swig. You nod sympathetically, even as your hands cradle your latest sourdough like it's a newborn. Interestingly, some hybrid transactions emerge. A half loaf plus a splash of rum for a shirt. A bun and a brass button for tutoring the local children. The colony becomes a strange economic stew of substances, meals, and favors. And slowly, as wheat farming improves and storage techniques evolve, bread gains ground. There's a fringe practice you try once, bread futures. You promise someone 2 loaves next week, in exchange for help digging your garden today. It works well until the weather floods your oven and your investor shows up fuming and breadless. You offer biscuits. He throws a spade. But this evolution from rum to bread is more than economic, it's cultural. People drink less, well, a little less. Violence dips. Women in particular benefit, stepping into more prominent economic roles through baking and domestic trade. Churches start preaching about honest labor over drunken folly, and even the local paper, handwritten, naturally starts publishing bread prices instead of rum rations. Still, don't forget your roots. Some nights you sit by the fire, listening to the older settlers grumble about the good old days of a pint for a promise. You sip weak tea and nibble your crusty currency, wondering if your grandchildren will ever believe that this whole place once ran on rum. Because you were there. You traded sponge cake for a fence post. You bought eggs with half a brioche. And you watched an empire sober up, one bun at a time. Your hands are caked with flour again, and not in the romantic, rustic baking way you once imagined. It's hot, your back aches, and a fly just landed on your dough for the 3rd time. But you don't swat it, because you're too focused on the rising frenzy around flour. The colony is changing. Rum is waning. And now, wheat is king. You remember the first time you heard the term white gold tossed around, not about ivory or pearls, but about flour. People are whispering about it in the markets. Soldiers are quietly asking about it on the docks. Farmers are hiring extra hands just to guard their silos. And you've started hiding small sacks of it under your bed. See, In the early 1800s, the British push for agricultural expansion takes root. Quite literally. Wheat is one of the only crops that grows reliably in the unpredictable Australian soil. It's not perfect, floods and heat waves still ruin entire harvests, but it works well enough. And more importantly, it's valuable. Historians still argue whether the government truly foresaw this shift or just stumbled into it. Governor Macquarie, for instance, promotes small-scale farming like his planning for Armageddon. He offers land grants to ex-convicts, hoping they'll become yeoman farmers instead of lifelong loafers. Some of them do. Some just build pubs on their new land and keep the old party going. You plant wheat. You watch it grow, stalks swaying gently in the wind. And with each passing day, you start seeing the world a little differently. You used to value coins. Now you value calories. Flour becomes the colony's great equalizer. A man with flour can feed himself, barter for tools, attract workers, or sweeten an agreement. Even churches start accepting flour tithes. And if you're lucky enough to own a grinding stone, you basically run a small nation-state from your kitchen. There's one miller down the road. He insists on being paid not with coins or even loaves, but with raw flour. He calls himself the Dust King. Wears a crown made of wheat husks. No one questions it. He's got good flour. You trade a week's worth of firewood for 2 sacks of the stuff. Not all flour is created equal, though. Some is coarse. Some is mixed with ash or ground up acacia seeds. There's one batch that smells suspiciously of mutton. You don't ask. The black market flour trade thrives. Convicts sneak it out of storehouses in their boots. Ships arriving from India or China often carry bags of flour, and dock workers siphon off small amounts before it's counted. You once meet a man who smuggles flour inside hollowed-out books. He calls it the yeast scrolls. And prices? Wild. During drought years, a small bag might fetch the same value as a week's wages. A rich settler once offers a cow for 3 sacks of flour. The cow refuses, but the settler insists. Your oven starts to feel less like an appliance and more like an ATM. You bake preemptively, stuffing pantries with loaves that never touch a plate. Some you trade. Some you lend out, half a loaf now, repay with 2 buns next week. People make promises backed by bread. Marriages are arranged over muffins. Someone even settles a boundary dispute with a cinnamon roll. It's not just the settlers getting in on it. Indigenous Australians begin interacting with this new economy in subtle ways. Some engage in flour trade themselves. Others refuse entirely, warning that the strange white powder the newcomers worship brings imbalance. They're not wrong. Bread's rise disrupts more than just dinner. Meanwhile, the government tries to regain control. They institute official flour rations again. Issue permits for bakeries. Publish the first rough guidelines for what counts as legal bread. It mostly gets ignored. You overhear someone propose a new law. Anyone selling loaves lighter than a pound shall be dunked in the harbour. He's only half joking. Children play games where they pretend to buy horses with biscuits. They argue over whose bun is worth more based on fluffiness. One boy invents a song, "My bread is big, your bread is flat, give me your hat or I'll take your cat." It slaps. And the flour mania spreads inland. Settlers push westward, carving wheat fields into the outback, building crude windmills and naming their farms things like Yeast Rise and the Toasted Acre. You receive a letter, scrawled on parchment and sealed with butter, of all things, from a cousin who struck it rich selling pancakes in Bathurst. A darker side emerges too. Wheat theft becomes a real crime. Entire barns go missing overnight. Dogs are trained to guard flour sacks. There's a scandal when a priest is caught selling consecrated bread as miracle currency. He claims it's symbolic. The bishop disagrees. And still, your routine doesn't change. You wake. You knead. You bake. You hide your best flour in a hollow tree stump and label it snake storage, do not open. No one ever does. You're not rich. But you're secure. And in this harsh land of heat, snakes, and unreliable boats, that's saying something. Because now, when someone says pay up, they don't look at your wallet. They look at your pantry. You've burned another loaf. That makes 3 today. The outside's crisp, sure, but the inside? Gummy. Dense. Like someone kneaded in clay. You sigh and toss it to the chickens, who look deeply unimpressed. But failure doesn't sting as much anymore, because your oven isn't just a place for food. It's your bank. The year is creeping into the 1820s, and you've fully embraced your new role, baker-banker. It's no longer just about feeding your family. It's about securing your social standing, your supplies, your safety. Your oven glows with more than heat, it radiates economic power. You bake with a purpose now. Loaves have price tags in your head before they're even browned. That seeded rye you're trying out. Probably worth a bag of onions and a day's help mending the fence. Those dense, round oat rolls? Good for bartering with soldiers, they'll trade those for bullets, sometimes even boots. Baking has become strategic. You've figured out which ingredients stretch a loaf further. Potato, cornmeal, pumpkin, all local, all useful. You mix them carefully, balancing cost, texture, and flavor like some colonial master chef. Except your prize isn't a trophy, it's a clean roof and enough wool for winter. There's a strange satisfaction in it all. Your ledger doesn't contain numbers, it's filled with crumbs and crusts, notes about who took which loaf, what they'll return, when they're due. A neighbor's behind on a promised bag of apples, so you make a polite reminder with a hot cinnamon bun. Passive-aggressive? Maybe. But delicious? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether this bread economy functioned more like a primitive banking system or a community credit network. Either way, it's functional. It's reliable. And it's run almost entirely by people like you. The regular settlers. Not the government. Not the soldiers. Just the bakers. Soon, you start to see patterns. Early in the week, simple loaves are in high demand, people need sustenance. Toward the weekend, sweet breads and fancy rolls gain value, people crave comfort. One Saturday, someone trades you an oil lamp for a honey-glazed braid. You wonder if that's sustainable. Spoiler, it isn't. You miss the lamp by Tuesday. Some neighbors take things further. The Thompsons, a couple down the hill, turn their front room into a kind of bread exchange. You bring loaves, and they pin up wanted notes on the wall, seeking pickled onions, need mending needle, looking for goat. It's like a farmer's market collided with a bulletin board and exploded in yeast. Their son starts carving notches into the crust of each loaf to mark its value tier. 1 notch equals basic, 3 notches equals premium. 5 notches. You're basically holding a deposit for a used canoe. It's ridiculous. It works. And word spreads. People start referring to loaves by what they can buy. A full crust might be worth a shirt. A half round gets you 2 eggs and a scolding. Burnt end means you owe someone. It's not formalized, but it's clear. Widows, convicts, farmers, even clergy, all baking, all bartering. Your entire economy is rising in ovens. There's even a brief but legendary phenomenon, bread lending. Here's how it works: you bake extra, and someone borrows a loaf with a promise to return 2 next week. Sounds simple, right? Except not everyone has your self-control. Some borrowers accidentally eat the interest. Others bake repayment loaves so small, they look like scones. One man shows up with a moldy bun and says it's symbolic. You return it through his window. You learn to be more selective. You start marking loaves with little dots of jam to indicate repayment terms. 1 dot equals strict deadline. 3 dots equals generous grace period. 0 dots? Don't even ask. And then, there's the baking alliances. You and your neighbor agree to bake together, combining your flour for larger batches, splitting the trade evenly. It works beautifully until you burn 3 in a row and she starts asking whether you're trying to sabotage her goat fund. You apologize. She forgives you. With conditions. You make it up to her with a 6-braid pull-apart loaf. It softens the blow. And her heart. Temporarily. There's even a fringe group of settlers who begin experimenting with bread savings. They bake hard, dry loaves that last months, almost biscuit-like, and hide them in storage pits. These are used as fallback currency in bad harvest years, kind of like your emergency coins, only crunchier. But a problem lurks beneath the surface: spoilage. You can't keep bread long, not really. Mice find it. Mold creeps in. Humidity ruins texture. And when your wealth is built on something that decays, well, you learn fast to keep it moving. Currency must flow or rot. To counter this, a few clever folks invent what they call reinvestment bakes. You trade an old loaf for a share in a new batch. One lady offers you 3 slices of yesterday's rye in exchange for a place in your next need. You laugh. You accept. Somehow, it works. You don't just live in a settlement anymore. You live in an oven economy. Fires light up at dawn. The smell of yeast drifts across the hills like a homing signal. You can tell who's doing well by how early they bake and how long their bread line stretches. It's all exhausting, yes, but also kind of beautiful. Because every loaf you bake is more than food. It's trust. It's survival. It's proof that, in a place with no banks and unreliable currency, you can still create value with your bare hands, some flour, and a wooden paddle. You don't just bake to live anymore. You live to bake. You slide a fresh loaf out of the oven, and the golden crust sings as it cracks and cools. A perfect dome. Slightly blistered. Rustic. But today, you're not going to eat it. You're going to trade it for a piglet. Yes, an actual piglet. And you're not even that surprised anymore, because in your corner of the colony, some bread is basically high art. Not all bread is equal now. We've moved past mere food or payment. This is the era of sourdough status symbols. See, when something becomes currency, it doesn't take long for people to start showing off. You might think this only applies to coins or fancy coats, but bread gets fancy fast. You remember when the most anyone cared about was whether it was edible. Now, people compare crumb texture, crust sheen, and flour origin like it's a royal pedigree. It starts subtly. Someone bakes with a touch of wild honey. Another adds herbs. You try lacing your dough with a swirl of pumpkin puree. A woman 2 farms over makes a loaf in the shape of a kangaroo. It's unsettling, but undeniably skillful. Soon, the colony's elite are commissioning loaves like portraits. You hear about a magistrate who trades a month's rations for a triple fermented sourdough, stamped with his initials in poppy seeds. Another pays a baker to craft a loaf shaped like the governor's face. Ironically, it sags in the oven. Still, the message is clear. Bread isn't just trade, it's prestige. You start experimenting, too. A 4-plat twisted loaf with dried figs earns you a second-hand kettle and 3 compliments. You begin branding your creations with a signature crosscut on the top. People begin recognizing it in the market like a logo. One child calls you the breadsmith. You don't correct him. Historians still argue whether this shift toward designer loaves was inevitable, or simply the result of isolation mixed with boredom and a pinch of good old colonial ego. Regardless, it's real. And suddenly, what's in your pantry is as much about aesthetics as calories. You learn quickly, presentation matters. A basic round damper might get you a handful of seeds. But if you brush the top with water, sprinkle a bit of salt, and score a clean pattern into it, boom, double the trade value. If it's warm, forget it. People will literally follow the smell across the field. One man offers to chop your firewood just to sniff the steam off your rye. Of course, as with any trend, things get weird. A short-lived fad spreads among the merchant class: bread jewelry, miniature crusts on strings, edible brooches. One woman shows up to a town meeting with a sourdough bracelet that crumbles mid-sentence. You're not impressed, but you respect the effort. Then comes the competitive baking circuit. Unofficial at first, just neighbors showing off. But it escalates. Someone hangs a sign: Best Loaf Contest, Sunday Market. No prizes. Just bragging rights. You enter with a braided sunflower loaf. You don't win. A former convict named Elsie wins with a puffed apple cinnamon crown that nearly causes a riot. You shake her hand. It's still sticky. Soon after, a tavern owner hosts bread nights, an evening of loaf judging followed by bartering. It becomes a local event. Someone starts a song. Flour and fire, crust and coin. Bake a loaf, and join the join. You pretend to hate it. You hum it all week. Now, class divides start showing up in bread. Laborious still bake for calories, dense, portable, fuel for long days. But wealthier settlers are baking light, fluffy, brioche-like creations. Bread becomes an expression of identity. Are you hard, practical crust? Or are you delicate crumb with a hint of lemon? You can tell a person's status by their loaf. One crusty heel? Probably a bachelor. A sliced milk bread with softened butter? Married, 3 kids, definitely owns chickens. The local preacher bakes sour loaves laced with black pepper. He calls it purgatory bread. You avoid eye contact when he offers you a slice. There's even talk of assigning bread taxes. A small portion of your best loaf, donated weekly to the garrison or church. It doesn't pass yet, but the fact it's proposed at all shows how seriously bread is now viewed. Your oven isn't just domestic anymore. It's political. But prestige comes with danger. One night, your prized batch of cranberry oat rolls vanishes from the cooling rack. You find crumbs near the fence. Tracks. A rusted tin where they used to sit. You're being targeted by bread thieves. You laugh until it happens again. So you start hiding your best loaves. You line a wooden crate with linen and lower it into your root cellar. You install a latch. Your neighbor catches you and jokingly says, "What are you, a baker or a banker?" You pause. You consider the question. Because really, what's the difference now? One loaf of your golden, herb-flecked ciabatta could get you a day's labor, a length of rope, and a chicken. 2 loaves. A small canoe, if you're persuasive. And as the value of style rises, You've stopped baking just for others. You bake for reputation. Your name is carried on crusts. Your cinnamon swirl is a calling card. Your carrot and spice rolls are described as intoxicating, even without a drop of rum. And maybe that's the biggest shift. You used to bake to eat. Then, to trade. Now, you bake to be remembered. You wake to the sound of shouting. Not cheerful morning market chatter, but panicked yelling, boots thudding on dirt, a clatter of buckets and wooden boards. You throw on your coat and rush outside to find your neighbor, poor Agnes, chasing a gangly teenage boy down the road, her entire cooling rack of bread missing. Again. Bread, you realize, is no longer just valued. It's being stolen. A lot. The colony has entered what folks are starting to call the rising crimes. Not rising as in justice and order. Rising as in yeast. As in the crime rate that bloats like an overproofed loaf. And when bread is currency, crime doesn't look like bank robbery. It looks like loaf snatching. Agnes is not the first victim. In the last few weeks, word spreads of counterfeit bread, loaves that look solid on the outside, but are hollow inside or filled with sawdust. You find one yourself during a trade, just barely catching it before handing over a bundle of carrots. The crust looked real. The crumb? Betrayal. You hold it in your hands like it just whispered rude things about your grandmother. Historians still argue whether these early bread frauds were intentional crimes or desperate improvisations. Some say it was the natural outcome of a system with no written laws. Others believe it reflects the arrival of more organized criminal elements in the colony. Either way, you lock your pantry. Suddenly, trust in bread as currency gets complicated. People begin inspecting loaves like they're diamonds. Tap tests. Weight estimates. One guy bites the bottom of every roll before agreeing to a deal. Disgusting. Yes. Effective. Debatable. To make matters worse, some folks start baking with filler materials. Chalk. Clay. Crushed termite mound. One man proudly tells you he stretches dough with eucalyptus bark for fiber. You stare at him. You do not trade with him again. This wave of dodgy loaves gives rise to bread inspectors, unofficial but respected community members who act as baking arbiters. One is a retired soldier with an incredible nose. He sniffs your sourdough once and tells you the flour came from south of Parramatta, milled by a left-handed man. You believe him. You also never leave your dough unattended again. One woman starts using red gum tree ash to seal her loaves, makes them look fancy, but really, it's just a signal to say, this loaf is genuine. It catches on. Soon, people are using scorched crust patterns, twisty knots, and even carved initials to brand their bread. You start doing it too, light cross-hatching on the bottom, your secret code. Like watermarking your money. Because yes, bread is money, but only if people trust it. Of course, not everyone is criminal. Some folks are just opportunists. You hear about a kid who buys up stale bread, soaks it in water, bakes it again, and calls it twice blessed. You admire the creativity. You also avoid his stall. And the bread thefts escalate. One couple is caught sneaking into a bakery under cover of night, loading hot loaves into their coats. The baker's dog catches them and barks the entire town awake. The next morning, someone paints a crude sign on their door, "Thou shalt not steal, nor toast." Public shame is swift. Their bakery credit evaporates. You give them a biscuit out of pity. It disappears before it hits their hand. Meanwhile, other settlers respond with security innovations. Bread safes. Hanging baskets on pulleys. Secret compartments in flour barrels. You see a neighbor tie his loaves in cheesecloth and hoist them into a tree, like food in bear country. No one questions it. Everyone nods respectfully. You also hear about the Black Crumb Circle, a rumored underground baking ring that controls rare ingredients, floods the market with counterfeit crumpets, and operates out of a hollowed-out mill. Do they exist? Who knows? But someone's bread smells suspiciously of corruption. Then there's the case of the moving loaves. 3 different settlers report finding extra bread on their doorstep, fancy loaves, unmarked, warm. Gifts. Tests. Threats. A few accept the loaves and find their chickens mysteriously missing the next day. You don't take chances. You leave yours untouched. It vanishes overnight. So now, baking isn't just economics or art. It's a minefield. Every trade is laced with tension. You weigh your loaves. You offer samples. You develop a reputation as someone who makes clean bread. Trustworthy. Honest. Flour forward. People respect that. You also notice the bread-related punishments changing. Once, stealing food was dealt with by lashes or jail. But when bread is money, the justice system gets creative. One thief is sentenced to 3 months of public kneading, forced to bake loaves all day for public use, under supervision, with thief carved in flour on his apron. Another is made to wear a necklace of burnt crusts for a week. You'd laugh, but you also reinforce your door. And somehow, amidst the chaos, you adapt. You double-check trades. You only barter with people you trust, or those who bring their own butter. You know a fresh loaf from a faked one by scent alone. Your bread isn't just edible. It's certified. Because now, a bad loaf can ruin you. A good one can elevate you. And a legendary one? That's eternal. Like the tale of Three Finger Nell, a one-handed baker who bakes loaves so consistently excellent, she becomes a local legend. She trades one sourdough for a horse saddle, then later for a wedding ring. She never writes down her recipe. It's lost to time. Or protected in a vault. Either way, she becomes folklore. A flour queen. And you survive the crime wave. You never lose a loaf. You once chased a thief with nothing but a rolling pin and a nightgown. He never came back. Because in this golden age of yeast and deception, one truth remains. If your bread is good enough, people will do anything to get it. It's barely dawn, and the smell of smoke lingers, part wood fire, part singed crust, part something more institutional. You stretch your arms, crack your neck, and tie your apron. Another day, another bake. But this morning, the knock on your door isn't a neighbor asking for a roll. It's a soldier. He eyes your oven, your sack of flour, your trays of rising dough. Ration inspection, he grunts. Ah yes. Welcome to the chapter of your life where the military tries to control your carbs. After years of chaos, bartering, and bread-based crime, the British authorities realize that things are getting a little unregulated. Loaves are being used in lieu of legal tender. Black market baking syndicates are popping up like moldy brioche. And the army's hungry. So now, the military is trying to standardize the bread economy, which means they've started assigning official bakers, commandeering ovens, and drafting soldiers into flour management. You know how some places have gold reserves? Well, now you have bread rations. Each garrison is assigned a baker, usually a grumpy private with no baking experience and a tendency to burn things. You hear one of them tried to make rolls in a cannonball mold. The result? Charcoal muffins and a dishonorable discharge. Historians still argue whether these military bakery programs were acts of control, survival, or sheer culinary optimism. Either way, they're happening. Soldiers are ordered to produce thousands of loaves a week, most of which turn out hard enough to qualify as defensive weapons. They call it barrack bread, and it's universally hated. But the idea is simple: feed the troops, control the flour, and maybe, just maybe, wrest back a bit of economic control from the civilians. Except, it doesn't quite work. Why? Because even the soldiers prefer your bread. One of them, a lean young corporal with ash-smudged boots, visits your farm twice a week. He trades firewood and gossip for your honey loaves. The exchange is hush-hush. He carries the bread in his shirt like it's treasure. Once, he whispers, "Yours doesn't taste like despair." High praise. You're not alone. All across the colony, unofficial bread streams start flowing from private ovens into military mouths. Officers request off-the-books rolls. Settlers bake in secret for extra rations. It's like prohibition, but with crust. Soon, the army realizes they can't compete with local bakers. So what do? They recruit them. You get the offer on a Thursday. A lieutenant in starched sleeves stands at your doorstep with a quill and a proposal: bake exclusively for the nearby garrison. Provide 50 loaves a week. Get paid in tools, seeds, and military protection. Translation: we'll give you nice things, and make sure no one steals your bread at musket point. You say no. It's not about loyalty. It's about freedom. You bake for trade, for neighbors, for people who appreciate a good chewy center. Not for bureaucrats with flour quotas. Besides, you've heard the stories. Soldiers taking half the dough for inspection. Bakers punished for loaf inflation if their bread gets too fancy. One poor guy adds rosemary to a batch and gets demoted to potato peeler. Still, some settlers accept the deal. And you see the results. Official bread marked with stamps. Loaves with military crests. One particularly sad bun shaped like a musket. It crumbles on contact. And then there are the ration riots. It starts in Sydney. A mix-up in flour delivery leaves the garrison with spoiled sacks, and the substitute loaves are so hard they break a soldier's tooth. The troops protest. Civilians join in, angry that their own flour is being redirected. For 3 days, it's chaos. Someone pelts an officer with biscuits. Someone else burns an effigy made of burnt bread crusts. The army backs down, slightly. They loosen flour controls. They allow some civilian sales again. You resume baking in peace. But the memory lingers. Bread is power, and when that power shifts, so does everything else. At this point, you begin to notice something odd. Soldiers who used to scoff at civilian nonsense now discuss crust techniques. One offers to trade a spare musket ball for your sponge method notes. Another starts his own sourdough starter, calls it Sergeant Crumb. You're horrified. You're proud. One morning, you find a loaf on your doorstep, crust scored like a uniform, topped with sesame seeds arranged in military stripes. No note. Just a wink from the corporal at morning inspection. Bread diplomacy. You approve. Still, you tread carefully. The line between community baker and colonial supplier is thin. You hear about a woman named Mabel who became the military's top bread contractor. She was paid in iron tools and sheep. Built a house. Got a letter from the governor. She also developed a twitch from waking up at 3 a.m. every day for 3 years. You're not Mabel. You prefer your oven small, your schedule flexible, your loaves personal. You bake what you want, when you want. No quotas. No crust inspections. Just hot, honest bread. That said, You keep a few emergency loaves tucked away, dense, high-calorie, travel-ready. Just in case the soldiers come calling again. Or in case you need to bribe someone. Or barter for a goat. Or pay off a local preacher who keeps hinting that your cinnamon rolls are immoral. Let him judge. Because in this world where bullets and flour are equally precious, you'd still rather trade with bread. It doesn't misfire. It doesn't rust. And if someone breaks in to steal it, well, at least they'll eat with joy. Your arms ache from kneading, and your fingers are dusted white with flour, but your real work isn't in the kitchen anymore. It's in the ledger you keep under your mattress. Pages yellowed with heat and oil. Crumbs in the margins. Notes like June 4th, 2 rye loaves fence mending plus jar of pickles. Or Tom owes 1 cob and a moral apology. Because welcome to your next reality, accounting by bread. At first, it was simple. 1 loaf, 1 trade. Clean. Direct. But now, as the colony grows and life becomes more interconnected, your world is tangled in bread-based credit systems. Which means you're not just a baker anymore. You're a banker, an auditor, and, on particularly chaotic days, a reluctant debt collector. It starts with IOUs. Owe you 1 damper, scrawled in charcoal on scrap wood. You laugh the first time someone hands you one. You stop laughing when a week passes, and that damper turns into 2, thanks to what your neighbor calls interest via inconvenience. Historians still argue whether this was a precursor to formal banking or just collective chaos disguised as civility. Either way, bread credit is now part of daily life. People make big promises. 1 woman offers you 10 loaves for a piglet, delivered over a month. You agree. Week 1, the bread is flawless. Week 2, slightly stale. Week 3, she brings you a biscuit and says, consider this symbolic. You reconsider ever trusting anyone again. So, you develop rules. Rule 1, no more than 2 loaves credit unless someone bakes under supervision. Rule 2, if they say just trust me, do not. Rule 3, never trade bread to someone who still hasn't returned your mixing bowl. To protect yourself, you start marking loaves with symbols, slashes for half payments, dots for full. You bake accounting into your crust. No, really. You once include a single raisin in a bun to signal someone's overdue. They bite it, pause, and mutter, fair enough. Others get creative too. There's a system emerging. 1 person ties tiny knots in the twine wrapped around their loaves. Another uses colored cloth flags. A man named Rufus carves initials into the bottom of each bun with a homemade brand. It's a whole bread economy language. Even the government notices. 1 tax collector confesses he's started accepting regulated loaves in lieu of shillings. But only the marked ones. No symbol. No value. The world turns. Yeast rises. So do expectations. And naturally, the arguments start. One morning, you walk past a full-blown loaf dispute outside the general store. 2 men shouting about a rye sour that was too airy to count as full payment. Another swears he delivered a 3-pounder, but the recipient claims he ate half during transit. A third simply says, it crumbled emotionally. That one you understand. So now, you spend hours not just baking, but auditing. You weigh loaves, measure dimensions, even draft crust clauses. You write down promises and get signatures, flowery thumbprints on strips of linen. You become the most organized person in your village. And the most suspicious. You can't help it. 1 bad debtor can throw off your entire week. You still remember that time you loaned someone 4 golden brown focaccias, and all you got back was a stringy apology and a muffin that looked like a doorstop. So you set up a little stall outside your home, where people can check their bread balances. A chalkboard lists names, debts, upcoming deliveries. It reads like a bakery meets a stock exchange. Folks come by to gossip, settle scores, and sniff the air. One boy tries to sneak an eraser and delete his dad's name. You hand him a dry roll and say, "Nice try." Children, by the way, have become bread brokers. They ferry loaves between homes, whispering deals. 2 cobs for an egg and a lesson in French, one child says, and you wonder who's teaching French. They invent games with bread terms. Crumble means I lose, crust means you owe me a turn. It doesn't make sense, but it's charming. And your own ledger? It grows thicker by the day. You color code trades. Add symbols for unreliable partners. You create a rating system, 4 stars for timely returns, 1 star if someone tries to pass off a scone as repayment. You start calling your pantry the vault. It holds more value than your old coin pouch ever did. Then come the contracts. Handwritten agreements. Parchment pledges. In exchange for 1 cinnamon swirl per week for 3 months, I shall roof your shed and not complain about the smell of onions. You draw a small bread icon at the bottom to make it official. A traveling preacher asks you to supply Sunday loaves for his congregation. Payment, spiritual guidance and free eggs. You agree. He later tries to renegotiate with a sermon on generosity. You counter-sermon with a raisin loaf so dense it requires repentance. Still, amidst the paperwork and politics, there's something sweet. Not in the sugar sense, though your honey walnut buns are legendary, but in the quiet order of it all. Because for all its complications, bread credit works. People repay, eventually. The system, as crusty and imperfect as it is, holds. You trade a spelt loaf for someone's old wheelbarrow. You receive 5 buns for tutoring a child. You extend a long-term crumb line to a widow with 3 kids. She pays you weekly, rain or shine, 1 perfectly formed roll at a time. And you realize something. You don't need coins, or banks, or royal decrees. You've built a functional economy, 1 loaf at a time. With trust. With record keeping. With a little cinnamon and a lot of elbow grease. You tuck your ledger away as the sun sets, warm bread cooling behind you, ready to feed bellies and balance books alike. Because in a world where gold rusts and coins vanish, bread remembers. Your hands smell like garlic and rosemary, and the crust you just pulled from the oven sings with that soft, brittle crackling as it cools. You lean against the counter, sipping weak tea from a chipped mug, and watch the sky melt into orange. This would be a peaceful moment if not for the fact that you're also waiting for your bread apprentice, who's now 37 minutes late and apparently thinks punctuality is optional when you're being paid in cinnamon rolls. Yes. You've reached the stage where you're teaching others to bake as currency. Welcome to the mentorship era. It started simply enough. A neighbor's daughter asked if she could help with kneading. You let her. She dropped half the dough on the floor, accidentally salted the yeast starter, and called your rising sponge goopy magic. But she was eager. And more importantly, people started offering goods in exchange for baking lessons. Suddenly, your evenings are filled with lessons for loaves. Want to learn how to get an even crumb? Bring eggs. Want to know how to stretch a dough without tearing? Bring a woven basket. Your porch becomes part classroom, part open-air bakery, part bartering hub. And you're a reluctant teacher turned flour-splattered philosopher. Historians still argue whether the spread of baking knowledge during this period was an act of survival, a rebellion against economic centralization, or simply the result of a very tasty chain reaction. But for you, it's just practical. More people baking equals more bread in circulation equals a stronger, more reliable barter network. Still, it's not easy. You start designing basic lesson tiers. Level 1, mixing without crying. Level 2, knowing when to knead versus when to rest, both the dough and yourself. Level 3, avoiding overproofing even when someone's yelling at you about sheep fencing. Level 4, the art of stealth baking for high-value barter. By the time someone reaches level 4, they're basically eligible for dough citizenship. Your graduates start baking on their own. You trade with them. You critique their crusts. One brings you a honey oat loaf with orange zest and says, "I call this the treaty bread." You bite in. It tastes like potential and a little too much clove. Not everyone's good, of course. One former student starts a competing stall and claims his bread has healing properties. Another tries to undercut you in the market with half-baked specials. You respond by slipping an extra golden brown loaf into the next community potluck. It wins universal praise. The room turns. You win the week. But overall, there's pride in watching the craft spread like fire through dry bush. Your bread students teach others. Families start forming their own oven teams, baking in shifts, trading as units. One settler builds a clay dome oven the size of a wagon and names it the Dough Temple. You think that's dramatic. You also want one. And the knowledge doesn't stop at technique. You find yourself passing down recipes, ratios, and rituals. The correct way to fold the dough for airiness. How to use an old iron as a makeshift proofing weight. Why singing to the rising sponge absolutely, definitely helps, you're only half joking. This isn't just economics anymore. It's culture. One man develops a family bread chant. Another tattoos a kneading pattern on his arm. A woman names her son Bannock. You're not sure whether to applaud or call for an intervention. Even the children get involved. They invent baking songs. One becomes a bread scout, delivering loaves from hut to hut with a straw hat and a wooden badge. You trade him a cinnamon knot for news of the town. He gives you gossip and 2 shiny pebbles. You keep the pebbles. You begin collecting baking lore. Tales of legendary loaves that saved families during storms. Recipes said to have come in dreams. One myth claims that if you bake with flour milled under a full moon, your bread will never go stale. You try it once. It's chewy. Still, the story's better than the outcome. And as the baking community deepens, so do the rituals. A couple gets married and bakes a single giant loaf together to feed the whole village. One settler passes away, and their favorite bread recipe is carved into their grave marker. A newborn is given their first bite of warm crust at sunrise, as if it's a baptism by gluten. You organize a small gathering, a bread circle. Not formal. Just folks sitting around a fire, sharing techniques, talking life. Someone brings jam. Someone else plays the tin whistle. A toast is made with slices held high. To crust, to crumb, to never baking alone. It sticks. You paint it on your oven door. But even as the flour flies and the yeast rises, there are quiet worries. Your original apprentice, yes, the tardy one, confesses she's thinking of leaving the colony for another. Heard they're trading raisin bread for horses up north, she says. You nod. You understand. You also slip an extra bun into her pack, just in case. Because here's what you've learned. Bread isn't just bread anymore. It's memory. It's meaning. It's how you pass down identity in a world where coins rust and kings are far away. Your hands may be rough, your back sore, your fingernails permanently dusted white, but when you see your old recipes in someone else's kitchen, when you taste your technique in someone else's sourdough, that's legacy. That's the flavor of freedom. You're halfway through shaping a batch of sweet buns, twisting them like tiny doughy pretzels, when a knock at the door changes your day. It's Thomas. Wide-eyed. Breathless. Holding something strange. It's a printed paper. More precisely, it's a small handbill from Sydney. At the top, in bold block letters, Notice of Currency Reform, Legal Tender Regulation 1826. Underneath, a tangled forest of legal words, promising the arrival of more structured money, proper paper notes, and here's the kicker, official discouragement of bread as a barter item. You take the notice, wipe your hands, and mutter the only reasonable thing. Well, that's stupid. See, here's the thing. Coins were always scarce. Paper money came late, and when it did, it was less reliable than your sourdough on a rainy day. Now the government is trying to muscle in and say, bread? Cute. But please stop pretending it's money. Except it's too late. You and every other sensible settler have built an economy around bread, not because you wanted to, but because it worked. It still works. And some bureaucrat in an office, 200 miles away, doesn't know the first thing about yeast. The paper even suggests penalties for using bread as formal payment. Barter discouraged. Standardized coinage preferred. You scoff. You'd prefer coinage too, if it didn't vanish into the governor's pockets or fall through the cracks in your floorboards. Historians still argue whether this shift marked the beginning of centralized colonial control or just another failed attempt to impose British logic on Australian reality. You have your opinion, and it involves loudly slamming your rolling pin on the table. Still, change trickles in. The new currency arrives slowly, tokens, notes, a few gleaming coins that make the children ooh and ah. Some folks start using them. Others keep one in a box under the bed just to feel fancy. But most stick with what's trusted. What's warm. What comes with a crust. Bread doesn't inflate overnight. Bread doesn't get stolen by the governor's nephew. Bread can't be smelted into a spoon when no one's looking. Bread, when bad, can still be eaten. Try doing that with a shilling. You get your first official coin during a flour trade, silver, worn, unimpressive. You bite it, because that's what people do. It tastes like regret. You hand it back and ask for a biscuit instead. But others take the change seriously. One man builds a locked cash box the size of a goat. Another starts calling himself a proper merchant and insists you convert your crumb holdings to real money. You ask him if he'd like a garlic flatbread. He accepts. Then tries to pay with coins. You laugh and take his belt instead. But truthfully, there's a shift happening. You notice fewer bread promises on your ledger. More trades asking for half and half, 1 loaf, 1 coin. Some people, especially newcomers, hesitate to value bread properly anymore. They call it peasant currency, as if peasants weren't the ones keeping everyone alive during the last flood. It stings a little. You remember the good years, the bread circles, the sourdough gossip, the hot rolls that bought shoes, soap, chickens, and even affection. Now, some folks wrinkle their noses at your stall and say, nice, for a trade item. So you adapt. You start offering bread-inclusive bundles. A loaf plus coins. A bun with an optional currency discount. You even hang a sign that reads, legal tender. I accept that too, but it can't be toasted. It gets laughs. It also gets business. Some folks dig in their heels. They refuse to touch coin at all. They hold up crusty bread proudly and declare, "Real value has crunch." You admire their stubbornness. You also bake them extra crispy rye because you know how this ends. There's a silver lining, though. The hybrid system that emerges is actually kind of brilliant. People use coins for big trades, livestock, land, imported goods. But for everything else, bread, or flour, or jam, currency and crust, hand in hand. The colonial economy settles into something more flexible, more personal. You notice something else, too. Those who only use money, they seem a bit colder, a bit more rushed. They don't chat at the stalls. They don't offer trades. They don't care if your crust sings or screams. They just want the cheapest option. You give it to them. But you miss the old days. Then one day, a young boy shows up. He's carrying a sack of flour, a half-cooked damper, and a list of questions. "My mum says you're the one who taught her to bake, and I wanna learn too." He talks fast. He smiles crooked. He reminds you why you started all this in the first place. You nod. You hand him a rolling pin. And as he stirs and stretches and makes a total mess of your kitchen, you feel it. The bread economy isn't dying. It's evolving. The crust remains, even if the flour changes. Coins may sparkle, but bread sustains. Coins vanish, bread is shared. Coins age, bread rises again, fresh and warm. So yes, the official system might have its say. But as long as someone's baking, someone's trading, and someone's slapping a loaf down with pride, bread remains currency, whether the governor likes it or not. You're stacking warm loaves into a woven basket when a familiar voice calls out from the road. "Did you hear?" he says, already out of breath, waving a folded piece of newsprint like it's on fire. They're calling it the bread boom. You blink. Because now, apparently, bread has entered the realm of economics headlines. It was bound to happen, wasn't it? After all the baking, bartering, branding, and breakdowns, the outside world is starting to take notice. What you've been living, sweating through, trading with, it's no longer just colonial improvisation. It's now a trend, a model, a headline-worthy phenomenon. According to this slightly crumpled page, local governors are impressed by the grassroots fiscal cohesion. Bankers are studying rural bread systems as case studies in stability. And one visiting English officer calls your village a crust-based miracle. You try not to laugh. You fail. Because if they'd seen the state of your kitchen last Thursday, burnt rolls, butter shortage, a child accidentally fermenting juice in your flour sack, they'd know miracle isn't the word. It's survival. It's stubbornness. And maybe, yeah, just a little genius. The article also includes something peculiar, a proposed bread standard. As in, a measurement system. One official colonial loaf to act as a baseline of value. 5 standard loaves equals a shirt. 2 for a dozen eggs. 1.5 for a dental check. It's all very organized. Very mathematical. You're flattered. You're also extremely skeptical. Historians still argue whether this attempt to standardize bread currency was the peak of colonial economic creativity or simply proof that things had gotten completely out of hand. Some say it was brilliant. Others say it was baked nonsense. You say, let's try. So, you attend the first bread standard meeting. It's held in the town hall, formerly a barn, still smells faintly of goat, and the turnout is impressive. Dozens of bakers, traders, bartering veterans. Loaves of all sizes laid out like offerings at a carb-themed council. The debates begin immediately. Whole wheat must count more than white, someone declares. No, sourdough has staying power. Should sweet breads be taxed more? What if I add olives? That's gourmet. Someone brings up gluten-free options and gets asked to leave. Eventually, a rough agreement forms. A medium-sized, plain, well-baked wheat loaf will serve as the bread unit, a sort of crusty coin of agreed value. It's unofficial, sure, but it gives people a reference point. And as odd as it sounds, it works. Suddenly, conversations are easier. Prices make sense. No more arguing whether your rosemary twist equals 3 handkerchiefs or a single boot buckle. Now it's 2 loaves and a half, or 3 bus with butter. Even the children get involved. They turn it into a game. What's the loaf rate for your toy sheep? 2 units and a bun. Deal. They form a neighborhood bread bank, trading crusts as if they're marbles. You contribute a biscuit and are declared an investor. Naturally, this new system brings copycats. Nearby towns catch wind of the bread standard and try implementing their own. One names there's the crust credit. Another insists on measuring by weight. A third colony claims superiority by using rye exclusively, calling it the aristocrat's grain. You ignore them. Because your system, developed over sweat, trade, and years of burned knuckles, has one thing theirs doesn't: community buy-in. Your town doesn't just use bread. It believes in it. And then the merchants arrive. Not just local traders, but proper merchants. The kind with coin purses, ledgers, and fancy shoes that clearly haven't seen a single muddy path. They come curious, skeptical, intrigued. They set up booths, offer goods in exchange for loaves, if necessary. They try to use the bread unit awkwardly, like someone trying a new dance move for the first time. One merchant accidentally trades 3 sacks of nails for a batch of banana bread because he misread the value chart. Another tries to negotiate with a walnut-studded sourdough, gets out-bargained by a 10-year-old with a focaccia. It's delightful. But it also changes things. You notice a sudden shortage of flour as settlers race to bake high-value loaves for incoming traders. Yeast becomes a precious commodity. Someone starts selling pre-starters in jars with names like Leviathan and Crumbthulu. Bread is no longer just barter. It's investment. Some folks start baking in volume, quantity over quality. You see loaves that are rushed, underbaked, flavorless. It hurts. You miss the artistry, the pride, the small, quiet acts of community that once defined your bread world. You're not alone. A group of seasoned bakers, including you, forms a quiet alliance. You call it the Crust Council. Your goal? Preserve integrity. Ensure fair value. Protect the meaning behind the loaf. You draft a loose baker's code. Bake with care, not just for coin. Never trade a loaf you wouldn't eat yourself. Remember, each crust carries trust. You share this at the next market. Most nod. Some scoff. A few openly mock it until their underbaked rye earns them a public spit-take from a dissatisfied carpenter. The council grows. You hold quiet tastings. You whisper reviews. You start rating loaves, not in stars, but in chews. 1 chew equals avoid. 5 chews equals recommend with butter. It becomes an underground system of culinary accountability. Because if bread is going to boom, then it needs its guardians. And you're not just a baker now. You're a crust keeper. A crumb chronicler. A fiscal fermenter. The bread boom is real. But whether it explodes or nourishes depends on what rises next. The summer sun is brutal today, the kind of heat that makes your dough overproof in minutes and your eyebrows consider quitting. You wipe sweat from your forehead with your sleeve and squint out toward the road. The air wobbles with heat, and the dust shimmers like a mirage. And sure enough, there it is. The first bread cart. It's pulled by a squeaky-wheeled donkey and driven by a man wearing a flour-dusted hat 3 sizes too big. He's shouting over a brass bell, "Hot loaves. Fresh crust. Price is negotiable but feelings are not." You sigh. You knew this day would come. Commercial bread sellers have arrived. They're calling themselves bread runners. Fast-talking, fast-baking opportunists who roam from settlement to settlement, cart full of loaves, ready to undercut, outsell, and sometimes outright lie. You're not mad. You're baking faster than usual, though. Just in case. These bread runners offer convenience. You've got to give them that. Can't bake? No problem. They've got you. Need 3 loaves by lunch and forgot to trade. They accept coins, nails, buttons, and once, apparently, 1 medium goat wink. But convenience has a cost. Their bread. It's rushed. Overmixed. Undersalted. It looks impressive, glossy crust, well-shaped, but you bite into one and your mouth is filled with the flavor of disappointment and floury regret. Historians still argue whether these bread runners improved access or diluted value, whether they democratized bread or simply sped up the rot. One thing's certain, they changed the game. Some settlers love them. Why need when it can be delivered, they ask. Why barter when you can buy? You say nothing. You just point to the wall where your crust council rating is proudly displayed, 4.8 chews, consistently delicious. People still come, but fewer, and more distracted. One woman tastes your olive loaf, nods, and says, "This is lovely, but that cart has bagels." Bagels. In a colony where half the people still can't spell yeast. It gets worse. Some bread runners start selling pre-made barter loaves, bread literally stamped with its intended trade. 1 equals boot patch, 2 equals haircut, 3 equals flirtation attempt. It's gimmicky. It's absurd. It works. One man tries to pay for a chicken coop with a novelty loaf shaped like the governor's face. The coop builder accepts. You lose 5 minutes of your life to stunned silence. Even worse, bread inflation creeps in. With so many loaves flooding the market, value starts slipping. A loaf that once traded for wool now barely buys a thimble. People start measuring loaves by weight, chewiness, and nostalgia. You adapt again. You start offering signature bakes. Limited edition. Artisanal. You add orange zest. Caramelized onion. A crust swirl that looks like a sleeping snake. You call one the pioneer's loaf. Another, legal tender, but toasted. They sell. But you're tired. You remember the early days. When every trade was a conversation. When your ledger was more bread than math. Now you're fielding complaints that your sourdough takes too long to rise and doesn't pair well with marmalade from the new shipping merchant. You take a walk. Down to the river. Let the steam rise off your shoulders. And that's when you spot them, a group of bread runners, stuck. Cart's axle broken. Loaves tumbling into the dirt. A dog running off with a rye like it's a trophy. The bread runners stand there, shouting, panicking. No idea how to salvage half their inventory. You sigh. Step closer. Roll up your sleeves. 10 minutes later, you've taught them how to triage a crust. Wrap damaged loaves. Steam stale ones. Re-knead if needed. They stare like you're some sort of carb sorcerer. One of them, the youngest, says, "Why don't you join us?" You shake your head. Because you're not a runner. You're a root. You don't chase. You build. And over the next few weeks, something curious happens. Some bread runners settle down. They ask to apprentice. They want to learn real bread. One of them brings you a loaf and says shyly, "I didn't use any shortcuts." It's still a little underbaked, but you nod. They start baking slower, baking better, and slowly, the market shifts again. The novelty loaves vanish. The crust as coin gimmicks lose their shine. People remember what they liked about your kind of bread: warmth, reliability, a loaf that fills the belly and the heart. A child tugs your sleeve one morning, holds up a roll with tears in their eyes. "This tastes like home," they say. And for the first time in weeks, you smile without effort. The bread boom doesn't end with gold. It ends with something better. With balance. Now there's room for bread runners and bakers, buyers and barterers, crust and coin. The economy settles like a well-proofed dough. Calm. Steady. Risen. You host a workshop, not a market, just a gathering. Everyone brings their own bread. You taste. You laugh. You offer one correction, 2 compliments, and a long story about the time you traded a stale roll for a goose that hated you. And someone asks, "So, what now?" You shrug. Now, you bake. Because bread is no longer just food, or money, or power. It's language. And you've become fluent. It's autumn now. The air has that gentle snap to it, cool mornings, golden afternoons, evenings scented with wood smoke and rising dough. You move slower these days. Not from age, but from rhythm. A kind of seasoned patience earned one loaf at a time. Your fingers still know the weight of the flour scoop. Your wrists still remember the pressure of the knead. Your ears, somehow, still tune in to the tiny sighs of fermentation. That subtle, invisible rising beneath a cloth. But now, as you roll out another batch of bread, something feels different. You're no longer baking for trade. You're baking for tradition. It happens gradually. Fewer requests for exchange. Fewer loaves assigned to fence repairs or seed swaps. More people are baking their own now. Or buying with coins. Or, brace yourself, shopping at the colony's first general store, which sells tinned food, textiles, and imported biscuits that taste like dust and regret. And yet, here you are. Still baking. Not because you need to, but because the act itself is a kind of living memory. People visit your oven now, not with ledgers but with questions. How do I get my crust this golden? Why does my rye always collapse? Do you remember that trick with the water bowl and the iron pot? You nod and demonstrate. No fuss. No trade. Just knowledge passed down like a secret handshake. Historians still argue whether this shift, from barter to ritual, marked the death of the bread-based economy or its transcendence. Some claim bread lost its value. Others say it found its soul. You know where you stand. Because as the coins clink in the market and the governor's portrait grins smugly from paper bills, people still knock on your door. Not for currency, but for comfort. One brings you tea and asks to sit by your fire while you knead. Another offers fresh herbs and says, "Just want to see the sponge rise again." A child draws you a picture of a loaf with angel wings. You hang it above your table. The bread is no longer a trade. It's a touchstone. A reminder of when things were harder, yes, but also simpler. Slower. Human. You still remember when a loaf paid for fence posts. When it bribed a soldier. When it bought you a kiss from someone whose name you've long forgotten but whose scent still floats in your flower bin on humid days. Now, your bread buys nothing. But it gives everything. It gives pause. Connection. A reason to gather around your table and remember. And make no mistake, your table is busy. Former apprentices come by, now bakers in their own right. They bring strange loaves with names like Sunrise Crunch and Whisper Bun. You pretend to critique, but mostly, you just chew and nod and feel your chest bloom. And sometimes, only sometimes, you bake a trade loaf again. Not for value. For sentiment. A woman once helped you when your roof collapsed. You never forgot. You deliver her a warm sourdough, sliced and steaming, wrapped in an old towel. She weeps, just a little. I thought you'd stopped. You shake your head. Only slowed down. Others follow. Bread becomes a gift economy. A language of gratitude. A quiet act of remembering what built the bones of this place. You pass by the general store one day. They've started carrying bread too, factory-formed, dry-edged, sealed in wax paper. It stares at you through the glass. You stare back. There is no contest. The clerk smiles. Still doing it the old way? You smile back. Still doing it the right way. And you keep doing it. Because the colony has changed. The economy has matured. The coins flow. The goods arrive on ships. The bureaucracy grows like mold on an abandoned crust. But the people, they still whisper about the bread days. They tell their children. They pass recipes on napkins. Someone publishes a book called The Loaf That Built a Colony. You flip through it, amused. They get most of it right. They miss the jokes. But they try. And one morning, just before sunrise, you open your oven and pull out a loaf so perfectly golden, so quietly proud, that you don't want to trade it. Or share it. Or even eat it. You just hold it. Smell it. Listen to the gentle crackle of cooling crust. And feel the warmth in your hands, not just from heat, but from memory. From all the loaves before. All the trades, the smiles, the debts paid and forgiven. Because this isn't just bread. It's your story. Risen. Baked. And still fresh. The sky is overcast today, soft and grey like an old bread cloth, and you're tending to the sourdough starter like it's an elderly pet that's earned its name, Old Reliable. It bubbles gently in its jar, alive with wild yeast, like it knows it has a job to do even now, after all these years. And you, baker turned bartering baron turned village relic, are finally doing something you never thought you would. Writing things down. You sit at the old pine table, notebook open, pages already smudged with flour, and begin carefully recording your life in bread. Not just recipes, though those are there too, but memories. Systems. Stories. The why behind the how. Because, let's face it, you've become a kind of folklore figure. People ask about you in nearby towns. Is it true they used damper instead of dollars? Did someone really buy a goat with a poppy seed bun? Did that one trade go sour because of a burnt crust? You hear the rumors. You smile. You don't correct them. Mostly because they're all sort of true. And so, the Crumb Chronicles are born, your working title. A handwritten, flour-speckled journal that details everything from the first trade loaf to the final bread circle. A living archive. A yeasty time capsule. You write between batches. While buns rise. While water boils for tea. You write because you know deep down that the bread wasn't just survival. It was a blueprint for society. Historians still argue whether the bread-based barter system of early Australian settlers was an act of desperation or innovation. You argue it was both. Because when you're desperate and imaginative, you make magic out of dough and diplomacy out of crust. Others are writing too. Your old apprentices have taken to recording their own bread tales. Some are more poetic, others practical. One even wrote an illustrated children's book called The Loaf That Could. You cried when they gave you a copy. Your legacy is slowly leavening. And more than that, it's diversifying. A neighbor has started experimenting with native grains, wattle seed, kangaroo grass, finger millet. Their loaves have a smokier aroma, a deeper texture, and a subtle earthy bite. We call it bush bread, they say, grinning. It remembers more than we do. You nod. You taste. You whisper, keep baking. Because bread, like people, evolves. One of the most exciting developments. A former bread runner, yes, him, has opened a hybrid bakery school called Crust and Coin. Half education, half commerce, all respect. He teaches both traditional baking and how to price a loaf with dignity. He credits you. Even carved your likeness into the sourdough wall mural. You're not flattered. You're horrified. I look like a burnt baguette, you say. But secretly, you're moved. Meanwhile, young settlers are picking up where you left off. They've started a bread co-op, pooling resources, trading surplus. Not just loaves anymore, but flour, jam, stories. Some even use bread-backed tokens, little wooden discs shaped like tiny buns. You keep one in your pocket for luck. And you're still baking. Not every day, but enough. Enough to feel that pull in your shoulders, that warmth in your kitchen. Enough to hand someone a roll and watch their eyes light up like it's gold. Because in a way, it is. That's the thing you've come to believe. Bread is inherently hopeful. It doesn't lie. It doesn't bluff. It rises, or it doesn't. It reflects its maker, rushed, overworked, calm, attentive. Bread reveals who we are. It's been your currency, your teacher, your community, and your quietest therapist. It's absorbed your frustrations, fed your neighbors, and carried messages far beyond your tiny settlement. You think of the time someone tucked a love note inside a brioche, or when an old man used his last piece of bread to feed a stranger's dog, or the time a birth was celebrated with a spiral-shaped cinnamon wreath that nearly caused a fistfight over the last piece. This is what endures. Not just the economics, but the meaning. So, when people ask you, do you miss the bread barter days? You smile and say, I never left them. You just changed the recipe. Now, as dusk rolls in and the trees rustle like gentle applause, you look at your hands, still steady. Still flour-kissed. Still ready. You write one more line in your crumb chronicles. Let the next baker inherit this fire, and keep the crust sacred. Then you close the book, stoke the coals, and prep one more dough for morning. Because someone, somewhere, will still need it. The loaf is warm in your hands. The final one for the day, maybe for the week. You take it from the oven gently, like cradling a memory, and rest it on a cloth-lined board. Outside, the sky is melting into gold, the air cooler now, brushed with eucalyptus and quiet anticipation. You pause. Inhale. Let the moment settle. Because this isn't just a loaf. It's a closing chapter. It's been years since you baked your first barter bread. Since you stared at your empty shelves and thought, well, I've got flour. Let's see what a crust can buy. Back then, you didn't know bread would become a currency, a community, a cause. You just needed to trade. And now, Now you're part of history, the kind that smells like cinnamon and effort. Your old oven's still chugging along, patched here and there with clay and tin and elbow grease. There's a dent in the stone where you dropped a skillet. You left it there, it tells the truth. Just like your sourdough, which still refuses to rise when you're grumpy. The colony has changed, of course. More shops, more rules, more polished shoes and less room for dirt under the nails. The children now learn math with decimals, not how many damper rounds equal one blanket. And that's fine. But something's stayed. On weekends, there's still a bread stall at the market. Not yours, you passed the table down to one of your apprentices, now grown, with stronger arms and louder laughter. She named it the original dough, and she keeps a little wooden sign tucked behind the apples, trade accepted. Not everyone understands it. But enough do. Because bread as currency was never about crusts and coins. It was about meaning. A shared language when no one trusted ledgers. A warm exchange when gold was a ghost. And even now, people remember. A traveler arrives one morning, dusty from the road. He asks where he might find the bread person. Not a baker. Not a merchant. The bread person. You're in the garden, pulling herbs for tonight's stew. You wave him over. He sees your hands, flour still in the creases, and smiles. He pulls a wrapped bundle from his pack. It's a loaf. Slightly squashed. Smells like rosemary and lemon. My mum said if I ever met you, he says, I should give you this. She learned from someone who learned from someone who, he trails off. You nod. Take the bread. Break it in half. Hand him a piece. You eat together under the pepper tree. Not a word of commerce passes between you. Only crumbs and laughter. Later, you return to your table. Open your worn journal. Add one last note. When bread is shared, history continues. And then, quietly, you rise. Dust your hands. Cover your starter with a clean cloth. And head inside. The light dims. The coals whisper. The air is calm. And somewhere nearby, someone else begins to knead. Now, let's slow things down together. You're sitting in a place where everything smells warm and safe. Where the only sound is the soft tick of cooling crust and the hush of night outside your window. Your muscles unwind, gently. Your thoughts soften at the edges, like dough after a long rest. Think back to the rhythm of it all, the kneading, the rising, the giving. Imagine your fingers pressing into soft dough, your breath sinking with each gentle motion. The world shrinks down to a bowl, a loaf, a fire. Nothing urgent. Nothing sharp. Just comfort. In the quiet dark of this early colony, life might have been difficult, but it was also filled with simple magic. Imagine bread being passed from hand to hand, from neighbor to neighbor, from need to nourishment. Imagine that warmth reaching you now, like a memory you didn't know you carried. You can almost hear it, the crisp crackle of crust, the faint bubbling of fermentation, the soft laughter of someone trading a slice for a story. And in this moment, as you sink deeper into your blanket, know this. You are part of a long, living line of people who've baked, shared, and remembered. Whether your bread is a barter or a gift, whether your oven is brick or memory, the ritual remains. So let the world outside fade. Let your breath settle. Let sleep rise in you like a loaf at rest. Because tonight, you've journeyed far. And now it's time to simply be still. Good night, baker. Sweet dreams.